So I'm going to start this new registration orientation session and welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. As I mentioned, I'm Pat Millar, the Registrar and Executive Director, and joining us today is Peggy Kell, our new Deputy Registrar. So the first thing we want to talk about for new registrants are your rights and responsibilities as licensed registrants with audiologists or speech language pathologists with the Nova Scotia Regulator of Audiology and Speech Language Pathology. Your responsibilities are governed by the legislation, which is set out in the Regulated Health Professions Act, the Audiology and Speech Language Pathology Regulations under that act, and the NSRASLP bylaws. So you can feel free to see the full text of all this information that I'm talking about today, which you can find on our website. Some of it may not be all that interesting to you, but there are sections, regarding scope of practice and that sort of thing that will make sense as licensed health professionals. So the first thing we're going to talk about is your responsibilities and expectations under the Regulated Health Professions Act, Section 60. And these apply to all regulated health professionals in the province of Nova Scotia. And some of these were set out before in our previous legislation in different ways, but now they're all gathered together in this section. So your responsibilities really haven't changed. They're just articulated differently in the new legislation. So as you would probably expect, you need to comply with the Act, the regulations, the bylaws, the code of ethics, and standards applicable to your profession. You are expected to cooperate with the regulatory body and the registrar by providing information when it's requested or participating in either disciplinary or complaints processes or renewal or registration processes as requested. You're expected to keep your contact information up to date, and we'll look at your registrant profile later to see where you do that. I will just emphasize for us, this really means your email address, because we communicate, all official communications go to you by email. So you need to make sure the email in your registrant portal is one that you check regularly and is current. You also need to make sure that NSRASLP is a trusted sender so that our emails don't go to spam folders. And of course, you need to check that email from time to time as well. You need to keep a record of your practice hours, which can be audited at any time. There's a field in your profile where you record the average number of hours you work weekly. And there's also a form that is available for registrants who are audited and asked to complete a form to advise of the number of practice hours they've accumulated in the past 5 years. The requirement is 1,000 hours over 5 years, which if you work full-time or even part-time is easily met. When it gets a little trickier for people is if you work in private practice and you have an irregular schedule, then we recommend that you probably will want to keep a spreadsheet and keep track over the whole 5-year period. Or if you're off for a period of time, if you're off for a year or two for a medical leave or a maternity leave, then we'd be only looking at 3 years in a 5-year period. And it can be something that you'd have to pay more attention to make sure you have your 1,000 hours. You're required to maintain your professional liability insurance as required by the board, and you're required to practice only within your scope of your profession and your personal scope, as well as comply with conditions or restrictions. And you are able to practice within any expanded scope that you've been officially authorized to use. Under the new legislation, the NSRASLP board has the ability to designate certain activities for expanded scope but have not done that yet. You'll be seeing more about that in the coming year or two. The second part of the section 60 is this was in previous legislation, but it's clearer and it's more it's explained better in the new legislation, and that is you have a duty to report to the registrar if you have reasonable grounds to believe that another registrant has engaged in misconduct or become incapacitated. You also have a responsibility to report concerns about other members of other regulated health professions to their registrar if you have similar concerns. The Act also provides that you're protected if you act in good faith, making a report. You cannot be sued or face legal action for doing so. In other words, even if it turns out that you're wrong, you say, I don't think this behavior of this person is appropriate, or I think they're incapacitated, and it turns out you're wrong. If you did it in good faith, then you won't be able to be sued or face legal action as a result of your well-intentioned mistake. Just delving a little bit into scope of practice, that's outlined in the regulations in section 7 and 8. You must practice within the scope of your profession. You must also practice within your individual scope of practice, which is defined in the legislation as the services for which a registrant is educated, authorized, and competent to perform. The section 60 also talked about the expanded scope, which I mentioned, that would refer to these reserved practice competencies that all regulators in Nova Scotia have the authority to designate. NSRASLP board hasn't done any yet, but the process will get up and running in 2026. And as we do with most things, we'll be consulting with registrants about that and turning to you for your subject matter expertise in identifying what should be a reserved practice competency or what higher risk activities may require as far as additional education or additional guidelines or standards. And just a note on scope of practice, our 2026 learning activity for the continuing competence program is really going to delve into scope of practice because of the new legislation. And it's not that your scope has changed. Scope is still founded in your foundational knowledge that you received in university and the skills that you've developed over the years. But it's described differently, and there are some additional wrinkles such as the expanded scope and reserve practice competencies. So you'll be hearing more about that. We're working on the 2026 learning activity now, and hoping it will be ready within the next 6 or 8 weeks. Under the new legislation, scope of practice also includes competency frameworks, which are the national competency frameworks and standards developed by the regulator, as well as guidelines developed by the regulator. So those are also covered in our new legislation as part of your scope. This is the parameters around scope are established through those other documents. Further rights and responsibilities are that you have the right to use the protected title. So we don't specify what protected title you can use or what abbreviation you can use, but what we do say is that anybody who wants to describe themselves as a speech language pathologist or an audiologist must be licensed by NSRASLP. And so it includes those specific titles as well as any derivations of them. So you would be able to call yourself an audiologist specialist or something if you were not a licensed audiologist, for example. Other rights and responsibilities, you're eligible to serve on committees and the board of directors as long as your license isn't conditional. For new registrants, your license is normally conditional until you pass the CETP exam. And you are entitled to receive official publications. And as I mentioned, that those literally always come by email. And so you need to make sure that information is up to date. I'm going to talk a little bit about the resources that are available on the public-facing side of the website, and I invite you to explore that when you have some time. It helps to familiarize yourself with what is there. There's some information on the public-facing side for registrants, and a lot of information for the public. And then there will be other information for registrants that's only available when you log in. So if you can't find something on the public-facing side and you need it, chances are it's within your registrant portal that you will see when you log in. So there's lots of information there about governance and policies, as well as all of the legislation that regulates the regulator. Your standards and guidelines are all there, public-facing. We need to be as transparent as we can to let the public know what you're required, what the education is, what the standards are for all of the audiologists and speech language and pathologists in Nova Scotia. There are some resources, practice resources there as well for registrants. There's a section on concerns and complaints for the public to contact us if they have concerns about conduct or are thinking of placing a complaint. We always try to resolve the complaints first without heading to an investigation. But obviously we will investigate if we need to. Also on the website are the public registers. These used to be called, under the old legislation, they were called rosters. And this is a listing of all licensed professionals, all licensed audiologists and all licensed SLPs in the province. You choose, there's certain information that we have to keep on that register as required by government. And then there's other information that's optional. You can decide whether you want to include contact information or not. We certainly recommend if you want clients to find you, that it might be a good idea to include some contact information, but that's entirely up to you. We have a new register coming that's going to be launched early March, and that is a new government requirement that we publish a register of all formerly licensed registrants for 25 years after they're no longer licensed. And there's a certain set of information that government requires us to include there. So going forward, if you retire, if you move to another province, the registrar will be asking you why you're no longer licensed in Nova Scotia, and that's because we're required to publish that information on the website for 25 years after you leave. There's also a contact information on the public-facing website, which is a public inquiries form. And this is intended for members of the public. Registrants have a special messaging system that you can access when you're logged in.